By 1984, the Contras' American-run campaign of economic terror and its human consequences was beginning to cause dismay worldwide, including the United States. One such critic was himself a former director of the CIA.
My concern is that it puts us in the position of being a state that sponsors terrorism. After all, if you're a ship captain from a third country, say Liberia, taking a ship into Corinto, Nicaragua during the mining period, and you're damaged or your life is endangered, you ask yourself, who did this? Well, it was the United States who sponsored it, and it's a terrorist act.
If you call that terrorism, then you're broadening the word terrorism out to normal warfare or insurgencies or whatever. To me, terrorism is aimed against civilians as a primary target.
Sadly, it was ordinary Nicaraguan civilians who were all too often the target of the Contras' terror. 5 days before Christmas in 1987, the Contras came here, to Ciuna on Nicaragua's northeast frontier, a peasant community of a few thousand souls. They took over the town for 24 hours and left more than 100 dead. After that, they regularly mined the only road into and out of town, inevitably killing the locals going about their business. And there are still mines here today. The people of Ciuna were not particularly supportive of either side in the war, but they, like so many others, became victims of Ronald Reagan's Contras.
Mi hijo estaba estudiando en Puerto, becado y...
My son was studying at the time in Puerto. He was on a scholarship. After he'd been there for about a month, he came back home for a holiday.
Entonces salió la contra la carretera.
On the way back after the holidays, the Contras stopped his bus about 15 kilometers from here. They let all the women go free, then they took all the men over the mountains into Honduras. Once they got there, they took all the people to camps and began to train them. They turned them into soldiers for the Contras.
Particularmente conocimos de muertes, de asesinatos.
During the war, there were killings, assassinations, kidnappings, the raping of women, and they even murdered children. If they were fighting for freedom, then they did it with an excessive and disproportionate use of violence.
Provocando, en definitiva, daños.
They have dismembered people while they're alive. They've skinned them alive. They have cut out their tongues. They have cut off their genitals. They have slit women's stomachs, taken out the fetus if they're pregnant. It's really horrible.
This manual was given to Contra trainees by Duane Claridge's CIA men. It's a guide to psychological warfare and advocates assassination and murder. Some would call it a terrorist's handbook, and it is based on manuals which were standard issue for students at the School of the Americas here at Fort Benning, Georgia, in the southern United States. The school, now renamed the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation, is a Pentagon operation and is paid for by American taxpayers.
De paz, libertad y éxito de esta gran nación. Salud!
Every year, roughly 2,000 of the elite officers of Latin America's armed forces are trained here in counterinsurgency, military intelligence, psychological warfare, and other dark arts.
The problem that we have in this village is that there are some guerrillas and there are some civilian, innocent people. And the students must be able to distinguish which are the guerrillas and which are the good guys. Initially, we have to treat everybody as a suspected enemy.
If you look at the course ranges that are offered to these individuals, they in fact are a dedicated way of teaching military leaders in foreign nations how to subvert their local communities.
The roll call of Latin American dictators and assassins who are old boys of the school is impressive. From Panama and El Salvador in the north to Chile and Argentina in the south. For death seems to follow the school's graduates home, and nowhere more so than here in Argentina. Argentine dictators, Generals Viola and Galtieri, were both trained at the School of Americas, like hundreds of other Argentine officers. These men presided over a reign of terror as they kidnapped, tortured and murdered tens of thousands of Argentinians during the years of the so-called Dirty War in the 1970s and 80s. Today, behind the facade of this anonymous building in a suburb of Buenos Aires, a small part of the gruesome legacy of the Dirty War is filed for the future.
We're looking to around 340 boxes containing each of them a human skeleton. These skeletons are coming from several mass graves we discovered 10 years ago in a cemetery outside Buenos Aires. Most of them are part of a population of disappeared people who were killed in between 1976 and 1978.
This was once a young man in his 20s, shot twice through the head at point-blank range, probably while on his knees. A victim of state terror. In March 1976, Argentina's fragile democracy collapsed, and following the sixth successful coup of the 20th century, a military junta of the three armed forces took over the government.
Como si la voluntad de Dios quisiera demostrar sobre estas tierras de cuánto es capaz el ejército argentino cuando lucha por la libertad, la paz y la justicia para su pueblo.
Claiming that the country was under assault from subversive elements, what followed in the next 7.5 years was an unprecedented campaign of terror by the very institutions that were meant to protect the people.
Hombres de armas, hombres que vestían uniformes.
Military men who were well-rounded human beings and respected the values of the Western world and all religions turned their back on all these values and implemented a system that can only be described as state terrorism.
Dejaron de lado todo eso e implantaron un terrorismo de Estado criminal.
By doing this, they discarded all legal, ethical, moral and religious decency.
Moral y religioso.
Well, the day I was kidnapped by the Air Force, they took me to a place I could not identify. They tied me up, naked, on a table, and then they started torturing me using electric shocks in my mouth, all over my body, my breasts, my vagina, my eyes. They were throwing water on me, and then they also use what they call dry submarine, which is put in a plastic bag on your head, and they were yelling at me, beating me up. It was kind of diabolic.
Miriam Lewin was a 19-year-old factory secretary when she was kidnapped in Buenos Aires in 1977. Miriam was a supporter of the leftist group called the Montoneros. Some of its members used terror and violence. Many, like Miriam, simply wanted social justice in their country. After being held for nearly a year by the Argentine Air Force at an unknown torture center, Miriam Lewin was transferred here, the School of Naval Mechanics, or ESMA, in Buenos Aires.